Hi everyone, and welcome to the Institution of Environmental Sciences COP26 Solutions Discussion Series. This is the finance topic, part of the final theme of the IES stages on the road to COP26. My name is Robbie Epsom. I'm the EMEA Head of ESG at CBRE Investment Management, and I'm joined today by three panelists, Rhyadd Keaney-Watkins from Associate Director for Strategic Advisory Services at WSP, Danny McNeice, Sustainability Manager at Pensana PLC. I'll allow them to all introduce themselves individually so they can give a proper introduction and also say a few words on the importance of finance in the context of ESG and COP26. But before that, just to set the scene a bit and give a bit of context on the IES's stages series and also the importance of finance in the context of COP26, given that we're in the final run-up with just 5 days to go before COP starts. So in the run-up to COP26, over the last year, the IES has been working with its members, other professional bodies and environmental scientists from across the sector to help drive the discussion and it's sort of to help keep that moving. They launched a series or a number of activities across 6 themes, which they've termed stages. And that's an acronym that stands for sustainability, transformation, adaptation, green society, economy, and then solutions, which is the final theme which we're talking to today. And at the end of this year of conversations, and in this final sort of stretch to the COP26 conference in Glasgow next week, this 6th and final stage is aimed to look at solutions based on everything that's been discussed across the year to date. So really asking ourselves, how can we most effectively fight climate change, given all the topics that we've kind of been through already? And like I said, the theme today very much focusing on finance. And as I'll go through in a second, that's one of the key aims of COP26. So quite apt. The final theme draws together all the ideas, challenges, and topics discussed so far, in particular the importance of science-based targets, evidence-led policy, and systems thinking, sort of all of which will be key to finding solutions. And maybe just to say a few words on the context of the actual steering committee. So the IES work is steered by the COP26 community. That's made up of IES members, including myself, who have come together to share our expertise and lead these activities, including panelists like we have today. And to bring these conversations together in the format aligned with COP26, we're going to be asking or basing our discussions around those 5 presidency themes at COP. So that's nature, clean transport, energy transitions, adaptation, resilience, and finance, as well as a wrap up at the end to really pull it all together. So the format of today's discussion, we've got 90 minutes. And what I'll do is just set a little bit more scene on where finance sits in COP26, because I think that's really important, and why I see finance as an opportunity when it comes to tackling ESG. Each of the panelists will introduce themselves, and then we're going to have a very informal kind of Q&A discussion. And I encourage each of the panelists to also, challenge each other and not just take questions from me. So I want to keep it really open and dynamic. So just to revisit the aims of COP. So there's 4 key aims. One is secure global net zero by mid-century. The second is to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats. The third, obviously very key to today, is to mobilize finance. And the final one is to work together to deliver that collaboration piece. I think just to dive into the 2 key bits of finance in a bit more detail, because I think it's really important for today's discussion. The first is that support for developing countries, and that's where developed countries must deliver on their promise to mobilize $100 billion every year in climate finance to support developed countries in terms of tackling climate change. But I think of particular relevance to today's conversation is that second point under the finance aim for COP, which is unleashing the trillions in private finance. And that's where we must work to unleash the trillions in private finance that are needed to power us towards net zero by the middle of the century. And every financial decision must take climate into account. So in my view, that's not only the third aim of COP, but it's also very much integral to that first one, which is securing that global net zero by mid-century. And just final thought from me, I think, before I pass over to the panelists to introduce themselves, is, climate is a interconnected and global risk. It affects all countries around the world. And I think what's really exciting about finance is it's probably the only global language. Every country on earth speaks the language of finance. But on top of that, finance is also fundamental to change. For things to change, it often involves finance, money, investment. So with that, I think finance sector as a whole has a huge opportunity to be a leader. I'm really interested to hear what the panelists have to say today. So at that point, I'll hand over to Rhyadd first to introduce himself, and then over to Danny
Okay, thanks, Robbie. So yeah, Rhyadd Keaney-Watkins, an associate director at WSP. Most of my work is split across supporting development finance institutions on their infrastructure investments, and also working with asset managers to develop clear, credible, meaningful ESG strategies which can deliver the change that we need to see in asset allocation, but also respond to the massive demand for ESG aligned strategies. Picking up on what Robbie said, the amount of private sector funding that needs to be crowded in alongside public finance is incredible. In the UK alone, we need to somehow get from £10 billion a year now to around 50 billion pounds a year by 2030. So the scale of the challenge is immense. But from my experience, I can see there's definitely an appetite. There's definitely an interest, and with the support of the regulations and policies we're seeing coming forward, including the likes of EU taxonomy, SFDR, which I'm sure we'll spend time talking about today, I think there's a very clear opportunity now for people to allocate capital in a clear, meaningful, and robust way.
Thanks, Rhyadd. And over to Danny.
Hi, yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Danny. As Robbie's already said, I work for an organisation called Pensana, and we are a relatively new organisation, and we're setting up to operate in the rare earth field. For those who aren't familiar with rare earths, it's a series of elements that need to be mined and then need to be processed, and the end product from that is a number of products that are essential to the construction of decarbonisation related products. So we will be selling products into wind turbine manufacture, and also parts that are essential for the construction of electric vehicles as well. And in terms of my experience, my role at the business is sustainability manager. And as part of that, that involves managing all our internal ESG systems, managing our internal ESG reporting, and putting together those internal policies, producing those external reports that we can give confidence to those investors that we are delivering high quality ESG programs, and we are putting sort of together the information that investors and any other financiers are looking for from us as a corporate organisation. And then prior to Pensana as well, I did used to work in the power industry. So I have a lot of experience working around energy and decarbonisation of energy grids as well, which we might bring into the conversation later on. Brilliant,
thanks very much. And I think so. I've got several obviously baseline questions that I'd like to make sure we cover, but I think this is such a big topic that I'm very happy that we keep it dynamic. We all come from quite different sort of industries, consultancy, industry and investment management. I guess is probably the three brackets which we're covering, and it'd be interesting to hear all the different views. I think before I jump into some of the kind of core questions, I think it'd be good just to maybe discuss how we see green finance when we talk about it, because it's such a broad subject. I think it means different things to different people. It would be interesting maybe just to go around the panelists, and I can also have my own views as to what you see, is green finance. Is it always green bonds? Is it and things like that? Climate, is it specifically climate finance, or are we talking much more about any type of investment across the economy? I mean, Rhyadd, have you got any thoughts coming from your background, particularly given the sort of lender experience you've had in the past, where ESG and finance has probably been established for a little bit longer than some of the current terminology? How do you see finance in the latest context?
I think one of the challenges we've had is on the plethora of terms that get used. So green finance is a common term, but does the green in that term imply environmental focus only, and does it not consider S&G factors, social and governance? there are terms such as sustainable finance. Is that the same as green finance? Responsible investment, climate finance, net zero finance. And I think a big challenge, generally speaking, is literacy and confidence in these terms and what they mean, and whether there is meaningful or intended differences between those terms. So I think that's been a problem, but I think we're at the point of a solution, or certainly a solution is emerging in the taxonomy. So the idea should be, if we're talking about a sustainable investment or green finance allocation in a particular economic activity, there should be a common rule book which either of us on the panel could pick up and very clearly see exactly what that threshold is. So, Danny, you mentioned power sector. We should all be able to come to the precise same conclusion that it means power generation for electricity which doesn't exceed 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, reducing down to zero by 2050. And I think that definition and the precision around what we actually mean by green and sustainable and responsible is central to the challenge of allocating capital in a way which pushes private finance in the right direction into the activities that will have the most impact. So from my experience, I think there's been an issue with terminology. I can see with the taxonomy, it's getting clearer. It's meaning that decisions are more transparent and there's greater consensus around investment decisions. There's a lot of work still left on taxonomy. There's a social taxonomy to come forward. And also balancing the need for specific definitions. I think we need to also make sure that the definitions and frameworks we adopt are broad enough so we have the allocation opportunities that we need to deploy capital at scale, and also flexible enough that we can recognize that there are some activities and technologies which will require investment for transitional purposes as well. So if something isn't taxonomy aligned today, but it's a key transitional activity, how do we make sure that the frameworks are sufficient so that those activities can receive capital, undertake energy efficiency improvements, deploy renewable generations on their facilities, transition to zero emission, zero carbon fleets, etc. So bit of a pivot on your question, but I think the key challenge has been one of definition and distinction for what sustainable means, and we're at the point where that's becoming clearer, and hopefully we can deploy capital in a more precise and impactful way.
Yeah, and I think that is exactly the key sort of point, isn't it? I think the language, not just in finance but in sort of sustainability as a whole, has been quite inconsistent, and I think particularly in the finance sector that presents a sort of barrier, because there's obviously a lot more nervousness when it comes to the shifting of large volumes of finance when there are different definitions and different sort of variants of green. And I think your point on green versus sustainability, and is that holistic? Does it include the S? It is key, and I think taxonomy is already making great progress in bringing alignment, and we're seeing it catalyze the green bond market, because again, people know they're talking about like for like. So if someone's raising capital for something that is billed as being a green asset or a green investment, the market knows that they're all speaking the same language, like you said. And hopefully when the social taxonomy comes out next year, that will also provide a greater sort of comparability on that as well. How about you, Danny, from your sort of side, maybe looking to your history in the energy sector, but also what Pensana does now, given the importance of the value chain, particularly with things like rare earths. How does finance kind of come into your day-to-day definitions? How do you see it?
Yeah, I think in terms of the definition, I think I'd probably echo in the main what's already been said, that of course you can look at somebody who might be issuing a green bond in one respect, but then a lender may of course have their own ESG criteria that may be applied to something that may not be branded as a green lending product. And I think I would very much echo, I think that the definition between these different terms can very much vary between which sort of area you're in. And as I would spend a lot of time sort of trying to understand what each individual product or what each individual circumstances was getting at. I mean, one of the things that I would certainly add on taxonomies is there needs to be sort of a wariness not to perhaps be too descript when putting some of these things together. And that's experience I've had in previous roles and in current roles as well. That some products, so for example, now, if you look at the EU taxonomy, the products we're supplying are not specifically cited within the taxonomy. And I think if these taxonomies become too rigid and it goes down the approach of very much being you're included, if you're not on the list, you're not in, then we can potentially come up with some challenges around some of these products that are absolutely essential to decarbonisation. And I think that is an interesting discussion point that needs to be thought about.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think it may be important also for those listening who might not be familiar with taxonomy, just to give a bit of context. So, I mean, the EU launched the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation (SFDR) and EU taxonomy over the past year, and it's, you know, in its most simplistic sort of description, I guess it's aiming to tackle greenwashing and bring in some sort of consistency to the market. But to both points, and I suppose particularly to Danny's, it's an incomplete framework at the moment. There's a lot of missing things, and equally, I guess, challenges from the market. You know, from our sector on buildings, you know, there isn't a KPI that's specifically in greenhouse gas emissions, for example, at the moment, and that doesn't reflect you know, the fact that you'll reach a point where energy efficiency plateaus and you need to look to other measures to get to net zero. So it's a work in progress still, but I think what it has done is it's starting to catalyze the conversation. But I suppose maybe going back to Danny's point, you know, is finance always going to be relative to the organization looking to invest? Is it going to be like credit risk, in the sense that, yes, we can have things like taxonomy, and I've seen that UK has published its taxonomy as well, pretty closely aligned to Europe's in the run-up to COP. Is there a place for taxonomy to provide a sort of guidance and a baseline? But ultimately, businesses are going to have their own appetite to risk when it comes to defining what they see as a green investment, and what risk they're prepared to take in terms of shifting their capital.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very valid point, and that's certainly something I've noticed where I've been working. There are other options on the market. There are people who will talk about shades of green when they're looking at investing. So there are options out there that will look across a whole business's activity, and will make those independent assessments on what's happening. And of course, that can consider what's happening through the full value chain of a product. So it doesn't necessarily have to be based on just the end product. So if you were looking at the power sector, you wouldn't necessarily have to say it's just the wind turbine that's relevant for the taxonomy. It's, of course, everything that's feeding in to building those products as well. And I think, to come back to your question there, I mean, it would be interesting to hear sort of what those in the finance sector, their view on that is. But certainly from my experiences, business, these people need to have a think about how you might consider that risk, because of course there are always going to be projects out there that might seem at the surface quite high risk, that might not tick off any existing taxonomy requirements, but of course could unlock decarbonisation down the line. So something like hydrogen production might be a good example of that at the moment. So there are several opportunities for hydrogen as a decarbonisation tool. So that's creating hydrogen which can displace natural gas, as an example, so reduce CO2 emissions. And hydrogen can also be used as a byproduct, or hydrogen can be used to facilitate other technical processes as well. But the challenges around something like that is that the ultimate production method which is called green hydrogen. Technologically is currently very, very difficult. And most people in the market at the moment are looking at something which is called blue hydrogen, which still involves some natural gas in the production. So still emits some CO2. So again, it's around understanding what the risk process might be for that, and how an investor or how a lender might look at that and think, well, hang on a minute, this might not currently be achieving a huge gain, but if we unlock the potential now, how do we support the longer term potential through investing in those projects?
That's a really interesting point, and it's a good link actually to one of the key questions I wanted to discuss today, which is how can we increase funding for green finance and access to that capital where it will make the most difference. And I think that's a really important point, because on the surface, it's things which seem like they might make a big impact in terms of climate mitigation or resilience. It's often more complicated than that. And how do we consider those sort of life cycle type considerations? And I'll throw it out there, but maybe just building on what Danny said in the first instance. Lithium's a good example, I guess, in the sense of that's a market that's about to explode. I think Cornwall's already billed as being having a bit of a lithium sort of gold rush. These sorts of minerals, rare earths, and various other materials are key to the transition to net zero, but equally come with them with their own environmental and, I guess, geopolitical in some cases impact. So how do we balance off where capital is best focused given the full picture? What are your views? Feel free either to jump in.
Yeah, and go on. I'll let you go first, Rhyadd.
Okay, thanks, Danny. I was going to say I've never been asked more about value chain risks and supply chain risks from clients than in the last year or 2 years, and the rate of inquiries on the full life cycle impacts and risks of products and services are definitely front of mind for investors. Coming back to the discussion we started on hydrogen, I think in those innovation spaces, there's clearly a role for public sector support and funding, and to help get it to a point where private finance will be attracted to it, and it'll be viewed as viable, and it can take off from there at scale. Jumping back to where impact can be made, clearly energy supply, transportation, industry, residential and commercial real estate, those four parts of the economy represent a significant chunk of carbon emissions. And within each of those sectors, there are opportunities for innovation and solutions. But as you said, Robbie, there's often the devil's often in the detail, and particularly on these rare earths and other raw materials that are needed, there are potentially unintended consequences in the value chain that need to be acknowledged. Renewable energy is a good example as well. Solar power, it's very attractive, makes sense from a solar generation level, but as you start to dig down into the detail, there's all sorts of supply chain risks that you need to consider, particularly the energy intensive nature of the panel manufacture, which in many cases is 90%, 95% of the total scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint of the development. So yeah, the devil's in the detail. A big part of the solution would be a move to circular economy and going from a use and dispose model to incentivizing and requiring the recycling of products and components. I was reading on the weekend, 1 ton of discarded mobile phones has 100 times more gold in it than 1 ton of gold ore, for instance. So that's just one real clear example of the opportunity that can be made if we can somehow get to a point where products and services have circular design and principles and disposal methods built in from the start. Perhaps, Danny, this is more on your turf. If you're probably closer to this than I am.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's a very interesting point, and that there has been a move in some jurisdictions to actually start to introduce regulation to this end, that sort of encourages people when they're manufacturing new products to think about the end of life even before they've started to take those products to market, for exactly that reason. The area that we're working in rare earths, we're actually looking at what recycling opportunities we have, which is a very challenging area. It's again back to this trying to sort of establish technology at scale to facilitate us being able to do that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There are opportunities out there to facilitate circular economy, and from Pensana's point of view, we're absolutely looking at that, and we're considering how we can unlock the potential of the recycling. But of course, the other challenge we have is that the market demand for rare earths is going to increase significantly. So the International Energy Agency, for example, have said it could be up to a 7-fold increase over the next 20 years. So even if we were to sort of focus wholly on circular economy, that would leave us significantly short for the overall demand that there are in the products. And where that's relevant, it is to come back to the point we're talking about before, when we were talking about what you might call unintended consequences, or what you might talk about as the wider impact of some of these things. And this is one of the challenges, or one of the opportunities, if things are assessed purely on a climate point of view. So we may, for example, displace hundreds, thousands, millions of tons of CO2 emissions by using a particular product. But if that's not mined responsibly, or to bring in other sectors, if the forests aren't managed sustainably, or if the quarrying isn't done sustainably, then you can end up with these situations where you might have displaced CO2, but you may end up destroying hectares and hectares and hectares of natural wildlife habitat. You may end up displacing tens of thousands of people from their homes and not suitably relocating them. But one of the things, as I say, that you can do out there, and one of the things we're looking at, and one of the things that the finance sector has done, is to set up the sort of guiding principles for this. So there is something called the Equator Principles out there that a number of financial investors are signed up to, which create minimum standards across the board. We're aligning to the International Finance Corporation document suite, which is 8 areas where you need to reach minimum standards, and it talks about how to actually manage some of these conflicts. So there might be situations where you have to look at those conflicts between wildlife habitat versus product availability, and you have to find workable solutions. So that I'd absolutely sort of make the point there that it isn't black and white, but these trade-offs can be done if they're managed in a sustainable and a responsible way. But that requires investments to not just look at displaced CO2. It requires that full suite of analysis across the whole, the E, the S, and the G as well, to bring that into the discussion.
It's such a challenge, isn't it? Because we've got to move at pace to tackle obviously the climate challenge. With 50% or thereabouts reduction globally by 2030, and obviously net zero by 2050. So to move at pace, but to also take into consideration all these wider risks. Thinking full life cycle is such a challenge. Because we don't want to end up in a situation where we have a sort of plastic type scenario where we think this is a great product from an engineering perspective, light, durable, but has a huge impact and a huge unintended consequence, which nobody really thought about at the time in terms of single use and all the other sort of challenges. And I think similarly with so many of the technologies that help us towards net zero, as we've just said, they have wider consequences. So it's great to hear that lenders are, and I remember in my days at WSP, them looking at Equator Principles and IFC as well. I mean, Rhyadd, on that point, are you seeing the lenders building in anything beyond Equator Principles and IFC? Are they starting to consider their own kind of minimum requirements to make sure they're considering biodiversity, material kind of resource scarcity, things like that as well, or are they sticking to the global best practice? I.e., is there room for improvement in the global best practice?
So within the IFC performance standards, I would say, form the backbone for the majority of development finance institutions. And within the IFC performance standards, there are various chapters, as Danny said. There's 8 chapters ranging from indigenous peoples to resource efficiency through to biodiversity. So in theory, that's a complete suite of topics to help avoid this risk of unintended consequences. And then you have some financial institutions who have built additional requirements on top of the IFC performance standards. So that might be, in a simple example, it might be an exclusion list where they have a particular view on projects or technologies which they just don't invest in. They may, in some cases, go beyond the IFC performance standards. So the IFC performance standards, generally speaking, is designed to introduce a minimum level threshold which can be applied globally, particularly in countries where local policy and resources aren't equipped to robustly manage environmental, social, governance risks. Within the European sort of geographies, sometimes IFC gets cited and used, but generally speaking, it's recognized that they're not as required in developed countries. Some financial institutions go beyond IFC and require compliance with EU directives, substantive EU directives, so things like best available techniques, which help promote best-in-class technology performance, whether it's within Europe or not. And that's particularly the case where you may have European tax-funded financial institutions who need to ensure that they're applying the same level of standards as they would within Europe, for example. So on top of that, again, I would say there's a few major financial institutions who are developing their in-house views on how they can help accelerate the transition to a future green economy. So that's looking at opportunities for additionality. So what can financial institutions invest in which will have a material, measurable, additional impact over and above the business as usual requirement in the country where the project's located? So there's a lot of thinking going on, and financial institutions, particularly in the development finance market, they've been doing this for a long time and are constantly pushing the expectations and requirements.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's it's interesting, because I mean, one of the questions I wanted to cover was how can we move towards a more circular economy to address our use of and efficiency of resources. And I think climate is such an interconnected risk that a lot of these unintended consequences that we're talking about, actually, whilst they are unintended in the sense of they seem on the surface unrelated, they do actually link to climate change in a lot of cases, whether it be deforestation, or even social impact, which affects communities, which again affects the way those communities act. There's so many interconnected global risks that it is important, if there's anything climate change has taught us, is we need to think at a systems level globally and in terms of the interconnected risks. So I think it's great to see that COP are considering nature-based solutions, collaboration, and all these sorts of things, because it is going to be absolutely key. And I think, Rhyadd, to one of your points, one of the big things is going to be that sort of circular economy principle of moving to a leasing servitization type model, where whether it be smart meters or or renewable technology, or even I guess in Danny's case, the electric vehicles sort of sector, much more moving to a lease model where the owners maintain responsibility for those materials and they stay in their value chains. And I guess that, I think, Danny, you were hinting at extended producer responsibility in one of the comments you made. That change from it being on the businesses to keep those resources in their value chain and also to be ultimately responsible for those decisions really changes the dynamic of the economy and hopefully starts to address some of those issues.
Definitely, Robbie, on your point there about lease models, I think a sharing economy almost certainly has to be part of the solution. I mean, for instance, a car is parked 95% of the time, and a power drill gets used for less than 15 minutes over its entire lifetime. So when you start looking at these products which people spend a lot of money on but rarely get used, it makes complete economic sense for it to be a shared platform, but that's going to require a fundamental shift in businesses, in how consumers view and act. So that the scale of, I think economically it makes sense, but the scale of the challenge would be in behavioral, I think.
Yeah, and we don't want to be ending up in a situation 10 years down the line as, you know, renewable technology. I mean, solar is obviously one of the much more advanced renewable technologies, but, you know, there might be improvements that we can't currently foresee, which means we could end up in a situation where those who invested in terms of capex end up, you know, landfilling or struggling to recycle various types of renewable technology 10 or so years down the line. So again, moving to a lease model where whether it be battery storage on site, you know, through Tesla and companies like that, where they take those technologies back as the market matures and, you know, put them back into the value chain, I think is going to be absolutely key. But maybe one thing just to ask is how can we increase funding for green finance? So how can we incentivize or increase the amount of finance that is shifting into more sustainable investments, whether that be, you know, through funds or in, you know, actual infrastructure, whatever it might be. Have you got any ideas from your various roles and experience where you've seen success in mobilizing sustainable finance? Maybe Danny, coming from the power sector, given how important that's been.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the things that I've seen some success with was working in and around the old the European Union emissions trading scheme, which has obviously passed to the UK scheme within the UK, obviously. And one of the things that does is, whilst it might not provide direct finance for projects, it almost discourages those projects that are sort of still in the high emissions or are still in the sort of the negative category towards climate. So there are options, not just to sort of encourage this through investment, but also by discouraging some of those activities that might not be proactive. But of course, the other things that have been attached to that in the past is things like innovation funds. And this is the question of, well, what do you actually do with the proceeds from these taxations or from these emissions payments? And one of the things that is out there, as I said, is these innovation funds, where the money from these products is sent out and is open to businesses or to public bodies to actually bid in to say, look, I have an innovative scheme here. I need some finance to either get myself through a feed project. I need some finance to get this off the ground and up and running. And one of the options that is out there is, of course, those innovation funds that can come from the increased taxation schemes.
I mean, maybe to pull that same sort of thinking into your sort of sector at Pensana. My understanding of, and you know, correct me if I'm wrong, of why the electric vehicle market's been quite successful is because of a sort of similar initiative where those large companies that weren't moving quickly on the electric vehicle space were effectively having to pay some type of tax to those that were innovating and bringing out electric vehicles. Is that the case? I'm trying. I might be making things up completely, but I'm
not familiar with that much detail on it, unfortunately. So I couldn't add too much there.
Because it's been an interesting. Yeah, I can't add too much detail either. It was one of those things that came up in conversation, but it's been that in my view anyway has been one of the successful cases, and I guess part of that is driven by the government's banning of petrol diesel vehicles in the UK towards the end of this decade. But from what I understand, there were some incentivizations similar to a sort of trading scheme. But yeah, I won't go into too much more detail because that's opinion based. And Rhyadd, on your side, have you seen anything from working maybe across the sector in a consultant role? You know, how different, I mean, thinking from lenders through to businesses, how you're seeing finance be mobilized? Is anything, any kind of best practice examples that you can cite?
Well, I've been involved in a number of projects where the Green Climate Fund has been given co-grants to projects. So where where projects can demonstrate that they're aligned either with climate mitigation or adaptation, or in some cases, so cross-cutting against the both. So providing those objectives can be demonstrated, then there is climate finance available. But personally, I think the biggest mobilizer of capital flows into sustainable assets, I think the opportunities coming from things like SFDR. So asset owners are already sitting on trillions of dollars of assets, and in my experience are actively looking for sustainable aligned assets to invest in. I think that the challenge has been the consistency and clarity and surety of the information being provided by financial market participants for financial products. SFDR should provide clear label, clear opportunities for people to create financial products to meet that asset owner demand, and providing that it can be done in a way which is sensitive to the points which Danny raised earlier. It doesn't sort of exclude swathes of the economy because they don't fit in clear boxes. Providing it can be done in a sensitive way, I think that additional disclosure and labeling should mobilize significant capital into sustainable asset classes.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's on, in my view, it's on two fronts. I think one is it's giving that common language, but I think it's also making sure, I think as you sort of suggested, that it's going to the right place. So it's to Danny's point earlier of the different shades of green, it's helping the market to understand where things sit. And I think in finance, it also recognizes that there's almost a place for those different shades of green. There are different things that need to be done. Some things are very, I guess, like the hydrogen example, green hydrogen versus blue hydrogen. There are a place for both of those, but it's down to individual appetite, what they want to invest in, and what they want their various businesses to be associated with. And I think as long as we can have a common language to present that and quantify that impact, it's down to those investing to make those decisions. I mean, one of the questions was how we can embed science and evidence in green finance approaches, when it comes to addressing climate change. And I think we recently raised 2 green bonds in terms of against one of our large European real asset funds, and we used, for the second round, it was 500 million, so in total it was $1 billion. And what was particularly exciting for me about that was, we used the obviously it was aligned with the green bond principles, but for the second round we updated our green finance framework to use taxonomy to which again aligns with the new EU standard for green bonds, and that really gave us the ability to set the bar in terms of scientific evidence. And albeit the jury's still out on whether those KPIs from taxonomy are the best, but at least they're giving us a starting point. And it allowed us to say, this is how we define a green project. And it really meant that we were able to set that bar in a way the market understood. So it wasn't just CBRE Investment Management's opinion. And that meant that sort of bond, or the finance that was mobilized, moved to a place where we defined what was green using scientific criteria in the sense of taxonomy. So that's been quite powerful. And I think, on top of that, you then get to overlay your house view of anything, like I think to your point earlier, Rhyadd, of any additionality that you'd like to go even further than that. But that has helped. Have you seen any other examples in your sectors of where the sort of science and evidence has helped in terms of that sort of sustainable finance approach, in terms of catalyzing the movement of finance? Or are you finding it still case by case as opposed to more systematic?
I would say it's case by case, but where, to go off topic slightly, I think an area which needs a scientific underpinning is in net zero targets and the use of science-based targets initiative. The ability to mobilize capital into sustainable assets is built on a foundation of reputation and trust, which is why things like taxonomy is so important. You're probably aware there are a number of high-profile investigations at the moment regarding greenwashing. If we want asset owners to allocate capital, they need to be confident that the objectives and outcomes are as per the project disclosure they were presented with. Net zero, I think, is another area we talked at the start, right at the start of the call. We talked about green finance, sustainable finance, responsible investing, etc., etc. Similar in the net zero space, science-based targets initiative, carbon neutral, zero carbon. I think there needs to be a lot of effort to harmonize the language and also the level of ambition. If someone is declaring to be net zero, have a net zero target, it should be science-based, it should be 1.5 degree aligned. And if it's not, it should be clear to the reader why it's not, so they can make informed decisions.
Yeah, no, agreed. It's I think it's been, I don't want to use the word cowboy market, but it's sometimes with these things they have to be a little bit all over the place before the market itself responds and things sort of settle down a little bit. But I think finance is such a broad and complex subject that it's probably never going to be a one size fits all, and there's always going to be those individual sort of appetites for risk. I'm just thinking, if I bring us back to the sort of detail of what COP26 is looking to achieve under finance, they dive into sort of two categories of public finance and private finance. Under public finance, they talk specifically about the aim being the development of infrastructure that we need to transition to a greener and more climate resilient economy. And under private, they talk about private finance, businesses to fund technology and innovation and to help turn the billions of public money into trillions of total climate investment. And when they talk about this, in terms of the COP26 aims, they're really saying to achieve these climate goals, this is under the finance aim. Every company, financial firm, bank, insurer, and investor will need to change. So they're really thinking of this sort of systematically, and again, all these different types of mobilization. So maybe just focusing on that public one, and maybe Danny, leaning again on your experience, from the power sector, Drax. How's the best way, because decarbonisation of the grid is just one of the absolutely key things, because if businesses are not going to move fast enough, the grid can do a lot of it for them. How do we best mobilise finance between, I guess, the public and the private sector to get that transition moving faster? But how do we also do it in a way that doesn't result in a rebound effect where every business just rides the decarb wave, which effectively means the power sector has to just keep moving to stay still, so to speak?
Yeah, and that itself is a challenge. So you haven't just got the case there where businesses can say, we're going to step back, the power grid is doing it for us. But we also have to be careful we don't go too far the other way, so that everybody, so when we talk about value chains, for example, so if I as a business have an upstream product, I think we have to be careful we don't go too far the other way, that the upstream company, the company I'm in, and the end company all try and decarbonize that one particular unit and leave other areas exposed. But I think in terms of the financing, I think one of the key things that there needs to be is just sort of that joined up thinking, so that you don't have these conflicts between public and private funding. And one of the examples that is coming to the fore at the moment is around this net zero target setting in that respect. So you obviously have a set of rules for countries at the minute that will operate off the IPCC carbon accounting rules. You have companies, many of whom will operate off GHG protocol. But one of the conflicts at the moment is these areas around international trading. So there are potentially scenarios out there where a company in the US, for example, could invest in a project in Ireland or France or Spain. And you could end up in this scenario where the US government or the US corporation might want to claim that carbon reduction towards their Paris targets because they've invested in it, it's their funding. But you also get the countries where the projects are hosted saying, I want to put that into my country's accounts and count it towards their own. So I think that the principle there really needs to be joined up so that we don't get these sorts of scenarios where you get this country versus private corporation funding barriers, because of course everybody wants to demonstrate their positive impact, but we have to be careful that everybody isn't claiming the same impact and we're leaving large swathes the climate impact untouched.
It's a good point, and it echoes, I guess, Rhyadd's thoughts on net zero and the importance to get those definitions right, and in particular scope and boundary. I mean, I hope, and maybe I'm being too optimistic, that the updated science-based target initiative criteria, which is I think it's been published this week, it's finished going through consultation. You know, I'm hoping that supported by the sector guidance, which they're working on in the background, several I think are going to launch at the same time as the main criteria, but there's definitely quite a few in the pipeline, and hopefully there'll be some for the finance sector, built environment, energy, and so on. I feel confident that is becoming the de facto standard for net zero in terms of how we talk about target setting, reporting. Like you said, Danny, it cites greenhouse gas protocol, but I think importantly, it's helping those sectors define those scope and boundaries, so you A, avoid double counting, but B, also make sure the people who are making the right effort reflect that reward and the sort of mitigation in the right place. Because you know, if an investor is going to invest in something, absolutely they should get some benefit for that, but it needs to be reflected in the right scope of their reporting. And equally, it may even be that we start to classify it as an avoidance offset, as opposed to a direct reduction in their sort of greenhouse gas emissions. Because again, we do want to incentivize investors to support these transitions, but recognize the difference between being an investor versus actually reducing GHGs in your own business and value chain. So no, I think completely agree, and it's it's a fast-moving space. I guess one interesting one which always comes up, and it'd be interesting to get both your views on this, is I suppose one of the best ways to get money into the grid in any country is to incentivize businesses and individuals to switch to green utility providers, because effectively that is shifting private money, individual money, away from the old legacy power companies towards the newer ones, whether it be Octopus, Ecotricity, whatever it might be. Does that work as a short-term solution? Are we going to hit a point suddenly where the Regos and Recs that would provide the backup that those suppliers are actually green suddenly aren't going to be able to keep up? Because at the moment that seems like a good thing to me on the surface, but are we heading for some complications where there's not enough renewable energy to provide all these businesses that are switching? What are your thoughts?
It's a very interesting question, and we could very easily spend half a day probably talking about power grids and renewable energy. One of the biggest challenges that exists in power grids is exactly that. So one of the things that we need to be aware of is that there's always a distinction between the actual power generation market, and there's a separate market for the renewable energy generation. Because in order to balance a grid in the UK, for example, National Grid will not be in a position where they can say every end user of electricity can align that consumption perfectly with those who are on renewable contracts versus those who are on generic contracts versus the additional generation and the additional services that the central provider will produce. So the way around that is that there is two separate marketplaces. So it's quite smooth in Europe and the UK because of the concept of REGOs. So most people will sign effectively a renewable energy contract up front. So it's one single payment that covers both the power generation supplied to themselves and the certificates, so that they know that for every megawatt hour they're taking, at some point over that calendar period or over that period, an equivalent megawatt hour of renewable energy has also been generated. It may not necessarily be at the same time, but on a mass balance approach, that negates itself. Where it becomes a slightly different challenge is in places where they have either public power grids or people have a single supplier of choice because they operate that grid. So parts of the USA, for example, people will not have a choice in supplier, so they will have to buy their power solely from the energy grid that they're supplied by. And in those jurisdictions, people will buy what's called a REC, or in some cases an IREC, where they effectively are doing the same thing as a REGO, but they're doing it on a separate market. Now, clearly, that is a good idea because it is putting private funding back into renewable energy, in return for the service that they're providing. But there are, of course, challenges with that in the fact it's two markets, and you've got to balance that need between there being enough renewable energy projects and structuring it in such a way that people can't just go off and buy the cheapest renewable project elsewhere in the world that isn't actually having the material impact on the power that they're taking. So yeah, at surface, it's a great idea, and certainly in principle and practice that idea does go a long way to helping decarbonize power grids. But there are, of course, as with everything else, there are challenges, and it's something that the companies purchasing need to be vigilant of, and perhaps something investors can consider when they are looking at whether a company is truly decarbonising or whether they're just finding ways around it or are doing it through sort of the quickest, cheapest, rather than the most effective route.
Yeah, it comes back to, I guess, that unintended consequences again, and making sure that if we are going to mobilise finance in any way, that people are looking under the hood at where it's actually going. And I think it's an interesting one, because when we talk about sustainable finance, it comes back to how we open the discussion. There's lots of different definitions, and quite often we like to package them up in things like green bonds, green loans, I guess lender requirements and things like that. But actually there are a lot of mechanisms like that which probably don't get on the radar when it comes to talking about sustainable finance, but are hugely effective. At CBRE Investment Management, we have about 130 billion of assets under management, and we have the ability to say, right, we're going to put in place a plan where we're going to switch all of these assets to offsite renewables. And that effectively means, without any investment from us as a business, effectively, we're able to redirect, that capital to support the grid. But I think, to your point, that has to be done in a way which is, backed up by REGOs, if that's the most effective way in the UK, or RECs or IRECs in North America. So yeah, it's about getting it right. And I suppose it comes back to, if you're going to do a green bond, making sure you're defining something which is the right shade of green for what you're claiming to invest in. And maybe just conscious we're into our sort of last 15 minutes or so. I think businesses have a big role. The UK government's net zero strategy that came out sort of only days ago, and the sort of language of government definitely puts a lot of the aim of this back on the private sector, back on businesses. What in your opinions, and we can keep this quite opinion based, because I don't think there's any simple answer. What should businesses be doing? What role can they play in addressing climate change when it comes to specifically, thinking of how they can impact green finance, and thinking everything from service industries, I guess, like WSP, to those in industry and manufacturing, and equally the investment side. What would you say are the top one or two things that you'd like to see businesses start to do to effectively vote with their wallet, so to speak? Maybe Rhyadd, if you've got a view from your side, otherwise.
Yeah, I think businesses now, they need to firstly, they need to be understanding their carbon footprint. So for many businesses, they fall within the scope of things like SECR, the Streamlined Energy and Carbon Reporting Directive. They'll be doing that anyway. But regardless, I think we're at the point where every business needs to understand its carbon footprint, including their scope 3 impacts as well, so the value chain impacts. Some businesses are adopting internal carbon pricing. So once they know what their carbon impacts are, they are voluntarily adopting internal carbon pricing, which then hardwires the carbon impact onto their investment decisions. So that is an option which some companies have adopted, and then the proceeds from that carbon pricing and other internal carbon levies can form a budget to help fund the improvements and changes they need. The final thing I would suggest is that all businesses should be adopting sort of TCFD recommendations and also net zero targets. So in the UK, for instance, the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, have released a number of consultation papers this year, which will be mandating TCFD within the financial system. But at a business level, I would suggest that whether you're within the scope of regulation or not, you need to be adopting voluntarily TCFD recommendations, considering climate change in your decision making. and approaching it from an opportunity perspective and a resilience perspective as well. The pace of change within the economy is going to increase significantly over the next decade. So these questions and these changes are coming down the line. It's a matter now for businesses to proactively position themselves and start to think now about how they can make sure they can remain resilient throughout the change that's going to happen.
I mean, and do we think that because once they start to do SECR, TCFD, that's effectively giving them their sort of focus areas of where their opportunities are for mitigation, where they need to maybe focus on resilience or adaptation. There's a lot that can be done. I think the conversation we've had today shows how many options are available, and even within something like the kind of electric vehicle market or hydrogen, whatever it might be, there are so many different paths that businesses could take. We almost don't have time for them to all be going off in the wrong direction. Whilst if the government's going to push the financials in terms of the private sector should be the ones investing in this change, should they then provide a bit more of a steer as to where they should be heading, or even potentially some type of marketplace that helps focus efforts and make sure that private finance is getting to the right technologies? I guess what I'm asking is there a place for the government to do some type of life cycle assessment of the key things that we're looking at, solar, renewables, electric vehicles, what's going to happen with HGVs, the grid, and provide the private sector with some type of steer, particularly I think for when it comes to things like offsetting, avoidance, removals, and there's a little bit of that in the voluntary carbon markets initiative already. But do we need a steer, or should we allow businesses to find their own way in this and leave it to the sort of capitalist type approach of innovation and business competition? I mean, quite a loaded question, but
I think we need clear sectoral level net zero roadmaps, and that can be something initiated by government through consultation with private business leaders in that particular sector. But with it, I think detailed sectoral pathways need to be developed so people can start to think about the changes that are needed and prepare for them. I think also for businesses, the challenge will be, and this is coming back to the discussion we had in circular economy, during the 20th century, the use of raw materials grew at twice the rate of population growth. So the amount of raw materials being consumed is massive, and we need to somehow get to a point where we produce and consume less, which in traditional business models perhaps doesn't align, and in some cases may directly contradict the model, which is selling products, improving products year on year, spring fall collections, all the rest of it as well. So businesses need to be thinking about how do they adapt their businesses to account for a world where we use less and consume less. And it's very difficult. I mean, it was only up until very recently the EU managed to require a universal mobile phone charger, for example. So when we're talking about the scale of the challenge and the fact that it's only recently there's a universal mobile phone charger, I think it illustrates how much has to change and how fast as well.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a good example of how a little bit of guidance does help the market go off in the right direction. Even when it comes to the fact that you don't need a mobile phone charger every single time you buy a new phone. But Danny, feel free to jump in if you've got a view on what businesses should be doing. Otherwise, I've got probably one final big bombshell of a question to throw your way before we wrap things up.
I think we should go for the bombshell question then.
So my view, it'd be interesting to see what you guys think, is offsetting probably creates one of the biggest opportunities to mobilize sustainable finance. I think that every business on earth is going to be left with, I guess what Science-Based Target Initiative would be terming the residual GHGs, i.e. those greenhouse gas emissions that they can't feasibly abate or reduce. And that really provides an opportunity. And I think offsetting, whilst it has had a bad rep, if it's done properly in a consistent and global framework, hopefully supported by things like the voluntary carbon markets initiative that's been launched in the run-up to COP, has an opportunity both in terms of balancing the books in businesses' transitions to net zero, and that's, I guess, the avoidance compensation piece, but also importantly in that removal offsetting piece for the residual GHGs at the end. Is that the biggest opportunity for business and private sector to mobilize finance and go beyond, I guess, their own internal operations and really start to help transition the economy? Or do you guys see that differently? It's quite a contentious subject, but I feel that it's changing and could become a core part of the sort of solution. So it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think that there's definitely going to be a role for, I would say, neutralization rather than offsets as a whole in terms of reaching net zero. Clearly, there's going to be businesses that will have hard to abate emissions. There are, for example, there's certain chemical processes in manufacturing that create CO2. There are going to be potentially issues around shipping as we move towards some of these dates. And I think absolutely, I think for businesses to be net zero, they should be in a position where they're having to purchase these negative emissions offsets. So whether that is an actual removal through a forest that's managed long-term and sustained, or whether it's a purchase of a technological removal through CCS or direct air capture, I think there's absolutely a role for that. In respect of, if you're emitting 1 ton of CO2, you should be purchasing that single ton of credit. Where I think the discussion needs to go next is how those current offsets are treated in some of these carbon accounting. So if, for example, you're looking at your solar powered cook stoves, so you might buy 1,000, 2,000 of them, which displaces maybe domestic oil cookers. Of course, that is displacing carbon. It's playing a huge role in decarbonising economies, but there's a challenge in respect to the fact that that is not negating the 1 ton of emission with a 1 ton of negative removal. So that I think there's really a challenge to thrash out how that would be treated in carbon accounting, and whether or not that will be part of net zero or not.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you both for your time. It's been a really interesting discussion, and yeah, I love to talk about sustainability, so I'm sure we could keep going. And like you said, Danny, several of the topics we could have gone into for probably an hour plus on its own. So thanks for your time, and thanks for anyone who's dialed in to join for this this final IES series in the run up to COP for solutions and the finance topic.